Venice shouldn't exist. If you look at it purely from a logical standpoint, it is the worst possible place on Earth to build a city. It's a lagoon. It's a salt marsh. There is no fresh water, no stone, no timber forests, and the ground is literally liquid mud that shifts with the tide. In the year 1100, if you flew a drone over the rest of Europe, you'd see castles on hilltops or walled cities in fertile valleys. But here, you would see something that looks like a hallucination. A massive, glittering stone metropolis floating directly on the water. I used modern AI tools to reconstruct Venice in the 12th century, a pivotal time when it was transitioning from a collection of wooden refugee huts into the most powerful economic engine in the Mediterranean. We aren't just going to look at the pretty canals. We're going to look at the mud, the wood, and the engineering secrets that kept this place from sinking into the Adriatic Sea for 1,000 years. To understand Venice in 1100, you have to understand the terror that built it. This city wasn't founded by conquerors, it was founded by refugees, people fleeing the collapse of the Roman Empire, running from the Huns, the Goths, the Lombards, ran until they hit the ocean. They had nowhere left to go, so they went into the marsh. They figured the barbarians on horseback wouldn't follow them into the soft mud. It was a temporary solution that became permanent. By 1100, that temporary camp had become a republic. But the problem remained. How do you build heavy stone palaces on top of soup? The secret is hidden underwater. If we could drain the Grand Canal right now, you wouldn't see stone foundations. You would see a forest, millions and millions of wooden stakes. This is the craziest engineering feat of the Middle Ages. Venetian builders realized that if you drive wood deep enough into the mud, down past the silt until it hits the hard clay layer called the Coranto, it stabilizes. But wood rots, right? Not here. Because the mud is so dense and the wood is so deep underwater, there is no oxygen. Without oxygen, bacteria and fungi can't survive to eat the wood. The wood doesn't rot, it petrifies. It essentially turns into stone. Every single building we are about to see, the basilicas, the bell towers, the palaces, is balancing on top of a dead, petrified forest of alder trees brought down from the mountains. It is a city built on stilts, hovering over the abyss. Let's start at the heart of the beast, Piazza San Marco. In 1100, this didn't look like the paved open drawing room we see today. It was smaller, grittier. A canal actually cut right through the middle of it, the Rio Battario, separating the church from the rest of the square. The ground here wasn't paved with nice geometric stones yet. It was beaten earth and brick, often muddy, filled with market stalls and merchants speaking a dozen different languages. This was the interface between Western Europe and the Eastern Empire of Byzantium. You have to remember, in 1100, Venice technically still had ties to Constantinople. They weren't fully independent yet, at least on paper, and you can see that obsession with the East in the architecture. Look at St. Mark's Basilica. This is the third church to stand on this spot. The one we see here in the Reconstruction was begun in 1063, so by 1100, it was the newest, hottest thing in the city. It doesn't look like a French cathedral with pointy Gothic arches. It looks Byzantine. It's a Greek cross layout with 5 massive domes. It looks like something you'd find in Istanbul or Cairo, and that's intentional. The Venetians were telling the world, we are the new Rome. Inside, it wasn't dark and gloomy like English churches. It was glowing. They were covering the ceiling in gold mosaics, millions of tiny glass tiles, each one angled slightly differently to catch the flickering candlelight. When you walked in here in the 12th century, it felt like you were walking inside a jewel. But the church is just a wrapper. The real treasure is what's inside the altar, the body of St. Mark the Evangelist. And the story of how it got here is the ultimate Venetian heist movie. In 828, 2 Venetian merchants were in Alexandria, Egypt. They decided that Venice needed a heavyweight saint to be taken seriously. So, they stole the body of St. Mark from a church in Alexandria. To get it past the Muslim customs guards at the port, they hid the body in a basket and covered it with layers of raw pork. When the guards opened the basket, they smelled the pork, were disgusted, and waved them through. They sailed back to Venice, shouted, "We have the saint!" and the city exploded in celebration. They built this basilica essentially as a giant safe deposit box for that stolen body. It gave them divine legitimacy. They weren't just swamp people anymore. They were the guardians of the Lion of St. Mark. Right next to the basilica stands the Doge's palace. But look closely at this reconstruction. It doesn't look like the pink, lacy, open Gothic palace you see on postcards today. In 1100, the Palazzo Ducale was a fortress. It had high, thick, crenellated walls, narrow windows, and defensive towers. Venice was still a dangerous place. There were rival families, street riots, and the constant threat of invasion from the mainland. The Doge wasn't just a ceremonial figurehead in a fancy hat yet. He was a military commander. He lived in a bunker. This complex housed the armory, the courts, and the prisons. It was the brain of the state, armored against the world. Tucked away behind the grandeur of the square is one of the most famous bridges in the world, the Ponte dei Sospiri, or the Bridge of Sighs. It hangs high above the water, linking the luxury of the Doge's palace directly to the cold, damp dungeons of the prison next door. The legend says that prisoners would pause here to sigh as they caught their final glimpse of beautiful Venice through the tiny stone windows before going down into the darkness forever. In reality, those stone grills are so thick you can barely see the sky, but the story stuck because it perfectly captures what Venice was. A place of breathtaking beauty on the outside, but absolute, ruthless control on the inside. And towering over it all was the Campanile, the bell tower. It started construction around the 9th century. By 1100, it was essentially a massive watchtower. It served two purposes. First, it was a bell tower to organize the city. In a time before watches, the bells told you when to work, when to pray, and when the government was meeting. But more importantly, it was a lighthouse. Venice is a nightmare to navigate by boat. The lagoon is shallow. If you don't know the channels, you run aground in the mud. During the day, sunlight reflected off the gilded roof of the tower, and at night, they lit fires. It was a beacon guiding the merchant ships home with their cargo of spices and silk. Now, we need to get in a boat, because in 1100, horses were banned from the city centre. The streets were water. We are going to head down the Grand Canal to the Rialto. Today, the Rialto Bridge is a stone arch. But back then, there was no stone bridge. It was a pontoon bridge, a chain of boats lashed together with wooden planks on top. If a large ship needed to pass, they would literally untie the boats and drift them apart. The Rialto, Rivus Altus, the high bank, was the only part of the city that was somewhat high and dry. This was the Wall Street of the Middle Ages. The noise here would have been overwhelming. This was the end point of the Silk Road. You have to imagine the smell, not just the salt of the lagoon, but the smell of money, spices, pepper from India, cloves from Indonesia, ginger, cinnamon. In 1100, pepper was worth more than gold by weight, and it all flowed through here. German merchants came down from the Alps to buy exotic goods to sell to the rest of Europe. But the Venetians controlled the tap. They invented modern banking here. The Banco Giro, the idea of writing a check instead of carrying heavy coins, evolved in these narrow streets because business moved too fast for metal. But how did they protect all this wealth? We have to go to the eastern edge of the city, to a place called the Arsenal. In 1100, this was just officially starting to become the monster industrial complex it would later be. The name Arsenal comes from the Arabic Dar al-Sina'a, meaning house of manufacturing. This was the first true factory in history. While the rest of Europe was farming mud, the Venetians were building an assembly line for warships. They had a system where a galley would float down a canal, and at each station, workers would add a part. Station 1, the keel. Station 2, the ribs. Station 3, the planking. Station 4, the masts. They could build a fully working warship in a single day. The Arsenal was a state secret. The walls were high. If you were a foreigner caught looking at the arsenal, you disappeared. This is where they built the galleys that hunted pirates and projected power all the way to Constantinople. These ships were light, fast, and deadly. They didn't rely on wind, they relied on oars. Hundreds of men rowing in perfect unison. In the shallow waters of the Lagoon or the coastal islands of Croatia, a Venetian galley could outmaneuver anything. But let's step off the warship and look at a regular house. What was it like to actually live here? In 1100, most houses were still made of wood with thatched roofs. This was a massive problem. Fire was the terror of Venice. If a candle tipped over, a whole island could burn. You can see in the Reconstruction that stone is starting to appear on the ground floors, warehouses for goods, but the living quarters above were timber. It wasn't until later fires that the government essentially forced everyone to switch to brick and stone. And here is the biggest irony of Venice: water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. The water in the canals is salt water. You can't drink it. You can't farm with it. So how did 100,000 people survive? They turned the entire city into a sponge. Look at the center of any public square, a campo. You see a stone wellhead, but it's not a well drilled into the ground, because if you drill down, you just hit salt water. It's a cistern. Underneath the paving stones of the square, they dug out a massive bowl, lined it with waterproof clay, and filled it with river sand. They slanted the pavement of the square towards the center. When it rained, the water would run into drains, filter through the sand, which cleaned it, and collect in the cistern. That stone wellhead in the middle was just a bucket shaft to pull up the filtered rainwater. Every drop of water drunk in Venice for 1,000 years fell from the sky. It was a communal system. If you poisoned a well, you were executed. No trial. The water was sacred. The layout of the city in 1100 was confusing. It wasn't one solid block. It was a collection of about 118 tiny islands linked by wooden bridges. Each island was its own little village. It had its own church, its own square, its own well, and its own rich patron family. You didn't say, "I'm Venetian." You said, "I'm from San Polo," or "I'm from Cannaregio." Rivalries between these islands were intense. They would have fistfights on the bridges, the battagliola, bridge battles. They would meet on these narrow wooden bridges without rails and punch each other until the other side fell into the sewage-filled canal. It was a sport, a way to blow off steam in a city where everyone was crammed on top of each other. And speaking of sewage, that's the other engineering trick. Venice is flushed by the moon. The tides in the Adriatic are strong. Twice a day the tide rushes in, bringing clean salt water, and twice a day it rushes out, sucking the waste out to sea. The canals were the sewer system. In 1100, you didn't have septic tanks. You had pipes leading directly into the water. It sounds gross, but because of the tides, it worked. The city was self-cleaning. However, at low tide in the summer, the smell would have been something historic. Let's move out to the edge of the lagoon, to the island of Murano. In 1100, the glass industry was just starting to take off. The Doge would eventually force all the glassmakers to move here to prevent fires in the main city. But even now, the furnaces are burning. Venetian glass was high-tech. They figured out how to make glass clear, cristallo, while everyone else in Europe had cloudy, greenish glass. They stole the secrets from the Syrians and the Byzantines and improved them. They made mirrors. Imagine living in a world where you had never seen your own reflection clearly, and then a Venetian merchant hands you a perfect mirror. It was magic. They guarded these secrets with their lives. If a glassmaster tried to leave Venice to sell his secrets to France, the Republic would send assassins to hunt him down. Intellectual property theft was a capital offense. But the real lifeblood of the city wasn't glass or even spice, it was salt. In the southern part of the lagoon, they had massive salt evaporation ponds. In the Middle Ages, salt was the only way to preserve food. If you wanted to eat meat in the winter, you needed salt. Venice had a monopoly. They sold salt to the mainland and they taxed it heavily. That phrase, "worth his salt," it comes from this era. The initial fortune of Venice, The money that built the first stone palaces came from evaporating seawater. As we look at the skyline of 1100, we notice something missing. The gondolas. You don't see the sleek black asymmetrical boats we know today. The boats back then were different, colourful, wider, often covered with silk canopies to hide the passengers. The law forcing them all to be painted black to stop people from showing off their wealth wouldn't pass for another few centuries. There was also a darkness to this time. Venice was a hub for the slave trade. They captured people from the Dalmatian coast, the word slave comes from Slav, and sold them to the markets in Alexandria and Constantinople. They sold timber and iron to the Islamic world in exchange for silk and spices, even when the Pope told them not to. The Venetians had a saying, "We are Venetians first, Christians second." Business was business. If the Saracens had money, the Venetians had goods. This pragmatism is what made them rich, but it made the rest of Europe look at them with suspicion. By 1100, the city was gearing up for its biggest gamble yet. The Crusades were starting. Venice realized they could rent their navy to the Crusaders. You want to go liberate Jerusalem? Sure, we can take you. But it'll cost you 85,000 silver marks, and we get half of everything you conquer. This mercenary mindset would eventually lead them to hijack the Fourth Crusade and sack Constantinople itself 100 years later due to the greed of Doge Enrico Dandolo, and they ended up stealing the 4 bronze horses that stand on St. Mark's today. But here in 1100, that hasn't happened yet. They are still the scrappy upstarts, the swamp rats who learn to build palaces. Standing on the wooden docks of the Rialto in 1100, watching the sunset hit the water, you would feel a strange energy. The land is unstable, the water is rising, the politics are cutthroat. But there is a sense of destiny. They took the worst piece of real estate in the world and turned it into a machine for printing money. They conquered the ocean because they had no land. This reconstruction shows us a city in adolescence. It's rough. It smells of tar and unwashed bodies and exotic spices. It's a construction site. Piles are being driven, stone is being unloaded, gold is being hammered into ceilings. It is the moment when the wood turned to stone, the moment when the refugees stopped running and started ruling. Thank you so much for watching. Also, if you're into learning cool stuff but don't want to sit through long, boring lectures, I actually built an app called Paladin. It teaches history in quick 5-minute interactive sessions, kind of like Duolingo but for history. If that sounds interesting, check it out.